There we go. And Catherine,
Okay,
please take
well,
it away.
I will. And thank you to those of you who came today, and there may be some other people joining us. I'll be talking about my book. The short version of the title is Family Declassified. And as Janice said, it's about my grandfather. This is a photo, an image of the book itself. It's available on Amazon, a Kindle, and directly from Sunbury Press, who's the publisher. Uh, my grandfather, this is my maternal grandfather's name was Ferenc, a good Hungarian name, Ferenc Kalnay. His American name was Francis. He went by that much of his adult life, but we all, in the family, we all called him Ferko. And what I'm going to talk to you about today is just are certain parts of my book. And at the end, I'll give you a synopsis of several other things that are covered that I won't have time to go into. But I wanted to tell you a little bit about my motives for doing the research and writing the book, a quick overview of some of the findings. And then because you're a genealogical society, I imagine there's interest in how I did this and some of the sources and methods that I use. So I'll go into that. So we'll start with my motives to research my grandfather, Francis Kalnay. When I was growing up, I didn't know Ferco much at all because he was living in Mexico. What I knew about him was that he published award-winning children's books, and this is one that won a Newbery Medal. And so he was living in Mexico for 20 years when I was young, and I'll go into that a little bit later about why he was there. But we had all of his books, and we would get boxes of embroidered shirts and marionettes from Mexico. And that was pretty much what I knew about him when I was young. And then what happened was, first of all, when I was 31, one of my West Coast cousins said to me, Kathy, did you know we're Jewish on our mother's side? And I was surprised by that because my family was entirely secular and neither of my parents went to religious services of any kind. And my mother in particular was quite adamant that she was an atheist, that she had no religion. And then, but at the time I had just had a baby and I was finishing my PhD and I didn't have time to go into it any further. But in 2015, I got a letter from a researcher in Vienna, head of a research institute, and he told me he was writing a book about my grandfather's time as a spy in the Office of Strategic Services in World War II. And I thought, spy? My goodness, I didn't know that. And then in 2018, one of my daughters gifted me a subscription to 23andMe. And when I got the results back, I learned that on my mother's side, we're 98.4% Ashkenazi. So that really floored me. And that meant, of course, that on my mother's side of the family, there wasn't just a Jewish uncle somewhere in the family tree. It meant that, of course, her siblings, her parents, her grandparents, all of her aunts and uncles, and all of her cousins were Jewish, and I never knew it. So that combination, the the request for information from the researcher in Vienna telling me that my grandfather was a spy, and then learning about my Jewish ancestry, which had been hidden. Those things motivated me to undertake the research for the book. So what did I find out? Who was Francis Kalnay? Well, he was born in 1899 in what was then the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And his mother was Rosa Margolit Kalnay. I had heard from the family, just a little bit that we knew, that she had died when my grandfather was 1 year old. Well, in fact, as I did the research for the book, I learned that that was a lie, that she was put into what they called an insane asylum, into a psychiatric hospital, when my grandfather was 1 year old. And she was there for at least 2 decades. And I'll come back to her fate later on in the talk. My great grandfather, Ferco, my grandfather's father, then took a mistress who was Catholic because his wife and my grandfather's mother was Jewish. But this is the mistress, Erzsébet Szentgály, And she was the person who my grandfather listed on his personnel records as if she had been his mother. And his brother, two of his brothers did the same thing. And so I've dedicated my book to my great grandmother, Rosa, because she was banished and erased and forgotten. When my grandfather was 15, he joined the Royal Hungarian Maritime Academy in Fiume, which is in Croatia, what is now Croatia. And then he was in World War I along with his three older brothers. And this is a picture of them with their, of course, their father, Joseph, in the middle there. And it's probably the last photograph of all four brothers together. And they were all in World War I for the Royal Imperial Army of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And then in 1919, at the end of World War I, my grandfather was on a Hungarian book, the Magyarság, and arrived in New York. And at the time, there were not serious restrictions on immigration from Central Europe. Those came in 1924 in particular and later. And so my grandfather was able to enter the country legally with a seaman's permit. 1 year later, when he was 20, he married my grandmother, Erzsébet Radkai. We all called her Elsie. She was quite a femme fatale, I think. And so the question that I wanted to understand as I was doing this research was, how did a Jewish Hungarian sailor who came into the country at a young age, how did he end up becoming a high-level spy for the Allied forces in World War II? And what I came to understand was that, and this is from my grandfather's, I got his declassified personnel records from what later became the CIA. I'll talk about the Office of Strategic Services, which is where he worked for during the span of World War II. But I got his declassified personnel records, and this is something that he listed himself in his personnel records, that he had been for almost 20 years an advisor to something called the Foreign Language Information Service. Actually, I'm giving a talk at the Center for Jewish History at the American Jewish History Association or Society on Monday, not Monday, a week from today, on the Foreign Language Information Service and on their Jewish Bureau and on how I think that served as a stepping stone for my grandfather. But I won't be going into that today. But what he did was he prepared press releases for the many foreign language newspapers. And I think in particular, he was preparing them for the Hungarian papers since he spoke 7 languages, but Hungarian was his first language and his first love, really. And the FLIS would translate and interpret editorials, make contacts with the editors of these papers, and then they gathered information from various government agencies and translated it and published it in these foreign language papers. These are foreign language papers that were published in the United States. At the same time, my grandfather was going back and forth to Argentina because those 2 older brothers you saw in the photograph, they tried to come to the US the year after he did, but their ship was diverted to Buenos Aires, and they settled there. And actually, my mother was born in Buenos Aires as a result. So my grandfather and my grandmother and my grandmother and her sister went back and forth to Argentina many, many times, and back to Hungary. So then when the United States joined the Second World War in 1941, that was the year that Ferenc began working in what was called at the time the Coordinator of Information Office. And that was the precursor to the Office of Strategic Services. And years later, the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, became the CIA. So he was working in a bureau called Oral Intelligence. And the photo here is of the director of the COI and later of the OSS, William Donovan, Wild Bill Donovan, as they called him. Here's a picture of my grandfather in his OSS uniform. And as I mentioned, he worked directly with the OSS for the span of, he joined 3 weeks after Pearl Harbor, and when the US joined the war, of course, and he stayed in until 1945. And later he was in a branch called X2, which was a top secret branch of the OSS And what they did was they were tasked with getting intelligence from fascist occupied countries in Europe, and also recruiting and training covert operators to go behind enemy lines to perform sabotage and to gather intelligence. And let me just, there's something on the screen that's actually covering up part of my slide for me. Okay. By the summer of 1944, he was head of that section, that X2 Balkan region, and that was Yugoslavia, Moldova, Bulgaria, Romania, and Albania. And he was also involved in designing some military strategies in Hungary, northern Italy, Turkey, and Greece. So he had actually a very important position. Whoops. Okay. So some of his accomplishments were, first of all, he was the director of what was called the Survey of Foreign Experts when he first joined the OSS. And this was a database that cataloged all of the assets that they could gather information on of fascist governments in Europe and beyond. And so the Navy would give ship manifests to my grandfather, and he recruited interviewers who went out and interviewed people landing pretty much in Philadelphia, New York City in particular, on ships from Europe to gather information from them. And so, for example, if you had worked for, let's say, a perfume company in Vichy, France, you would be likely to know about sources of chemicals and transportation systems, and those things in the pre-internet age would be the only sources of information that could easily be obtained about Nazi-occupied countries. And so these interviewers, led by my grandfather, developed a huge database of all kinds of strategic information that could be used in World War II by the Allies. This is something, just a paragraph that was written by the head of the European X2 operations. On numerous occasions, Mr. Kalnay's careful piecing together of fragmentary evidence revealed facts about Abwehr, the German military service, secret service, and Reich security functioning in Central and Western Europe, which the activities of agents and controlled enemy agents in those regions had failed to uncover. So that's a pretty significant statement of his importance. His accomplishments included recruiting and training and supervising resistance fighters right in the heart of Axis territory in Europe and parts of the Middle East, and then planning sabotage and propaganda efforts in the Balkans and also in Hungary. Here's another quote. This is from the deputy director of the OSS for psychological warfare. Psychological warfare was completely new to the American forces in World War II. And my grandfather was at the heart of it. And this director said, Mr. Kalnay is doing currently one of the most intelligent organizational jobs in connection with his mission, which I have ever seen done in the annals of OSS. So one of the things that began to be weighing on my mind was, what was happening in Hungary to my grandfather's family members who were still in Budapest during the war and during this period? If you know about the Holocaust in Hungary, it was perhaps the most brutal site of the Holocaust in Europe in many ways. And in March, very late in the war, in March of 1944 is when Hitler invaded Hungary. And at that point, he planned the invasion to try to keep Hungary from defecting from the Third Reich in the way that Italy and Finland and Bulgaria and Romania had done or were about to do. So although the war in Europe was almost over in March of 1944, close to 75% of the Jewish population in Hungary, almost 600,000 Jews, were murdered in 12 months. That's why I say that it was perhaps the most brutal example of the Holocaust in Europe. And this happened so quickly. In March 1944, the Germans invaded. By April 5th, matter of weeks later, all Hungarian Jews were required to wear yellow stars on their clothing. 220,000 Hungarian Jews in Budapest were forced to move into just 2,000 yellow star houses in the city to facilitate their deportation, in particular to Auschwitz. And by mid-May, 2 months later, 800,000 Hungarian Jews had been forced into ghettos or prison camps nationwide. So again, what was weighing on my mind was what happened to my great-grandmother, to my great aunt and my mother's cousin, those who remained in Budapest after the Nazi invasion in 1944, at a time when my grandfather had such a key role in intelligence efforts in the region. Well, if you remember that picture I showed you of that beautiful young woman who was put into a psychiatric hospital, she was released after perhaps 20 years, and her daughter, Borbala, or Boriska, she was also called, took care of her for many years after she was released. And this is a picture of the two of them. Ironically, Borbala was able to get a Schutzpass. This was Raoul Wallenberg letter of protection that saved several thousand Hungarian Jews by defining them as Swedish citizens and saying that the houses were controlled by the embassy of Sweden, and it worked for many Hungarian Jews. But my great aunt's son, Dennis Noti was his name, had been conscripted into a forced labor camp, and she didn't want, my great aunt and my great grandmother didn't want to leave the country while the grandchild and son was in this forced labor camp. And of course, I can understand that. This is a picture of some of the laborers who were laying rails in the winter of 1944. Many of them were marched in the dead of winter up to the Austrian border to reinforce that border for the Nazis. And the conditions were just horrific. And this is where my mother's cousin, my Rosa's grandchild, was conscripted and worked. And this is a picture of women and children in Budapest, Jewish women and children with yellow stars of David being marched. I don't know if they're being marched into the ghetto or into yellow star houses, or even worse, to the train yards to take them to Auschwitz. Here's a picture of one of the houses, one of those 2,000 yellow star houses in Budapest in 1944 after the Nazi invasion. So what happened was that Ferenc's sister Borbala, who didn't leave, although she had a Schutzpass for the family, was arrested and taken to the fascist headquarters. The Nazi equivalent in Hungary was called the Arrow Cross. Many people say they were even more brutal than the SS. And my great aunt was beaten to death there at age 52 on December 2nd, 1944. Her mother and my grandfather's mother died 1 month later of heart failure on January 3rd. Not difficult to understand how that might have happened. And then the son, whom I mentioned, Dennis, who was in the forced labor camp, was shot to death in that camp 3 weeks before the Soviets liberated the camp. And if you've been to Budapest, you may have seen, you may know about the banks of the Danube, where so many Jews were shot, thrown into the Danube River. And you may have seen this very moving, these are bronzed shoes that represent the Jews who were disrobed and thrown into the river and shot. I wanted to put in this picture of Borbala, again, my great aunt who was beaten to death. I wanted to put in a picture of her in earlier years, in 1930, in this case, well before the war, a happier time, to have a different memory of her. And today, actually, I learned a month ago that she had been a painter. I hadn't known that. And just today, I got online with the gallery in Budapest that owns this painting of hers and purchased it. So I'm really looking forward to owning this picture and again having a happier memory of my great aunt. Now, there was a conspiracy of silence about our ancestry and the fate of our family members among the Kalnay family. My mother never mentioned it. My grandmother never mentioned it. My grandfather never mentioned that we were Jewish. As I say, if you weren't here at the very beginning of my talk, I began by saying that I didn't learn that I was Jewish until I heard a mention of it when I was 30. And then only in 2018 did I learn that on my mother's side, the whole family was Jewish, 98.4% Ashkenazi. On my father's side, I'm German, Irish, and not Jewish. But so I'm 50% Jewish, and I never knew this. And in particular in Argentina, where the family members were very Catholic, there was a real reluctance to do any acknowledging of Judaism. I talk about this in the book. So what did Ferco do after the war? Well, he first went to California. He left the OSS in 1945, and he first went to had a farm and a vineyard in Northern California in the Ojai Valley. He designed ovens and baked bread and grew all kinds of grapes and fresh herbs and so on. And then I found a book that was written by his assistant, who was also said to be his lover in the OSS, Sylvia Cross. And she wrote what was ostensibly fiction, but everyone at the time said that in fact it was nonfiction, couched as fiction, with names changed, but describing her work with my grandfather. And she, Sylvia Cross, the author, had been working for the OSS the same time period, the same places as my grandfather. And she was, but she stayed in after he had left in 1945. And she was fired and denied her pension. And in the book, it's described as being because of working for the man. I think it's quite clear with my grandfather. And that was because of his work with Tito, the head of the partisans in Yugoslavia. And the US government, of course, supported Tito because he was anti-fascist during World War II. But in the McCarthy era, if you had any association with the communists, you were suddenly suspect, even though, as I say, that was sanctioned by the government. And so my grandfather, Ferco, knew many people who were being called in to testify. Now, he had left the OSS, so he wasn't called into Congress, but he fled to Mexico. This is the book that Sylvia Press wrote called The Care of Devils. And as I mentioned, there were two main resistance movements, and it was the independent communist leader, Joseph Broz, or Tito, who was the one who was then, I believe, led to so many people being called up before in the McCarthy hearings. So my grandfather moved to Mexico. First, he was in the Ojai Valley in California, but then during these hearings and just afterwards, he fled to Mexico, and he was there for 20 years. He was in a town called Valle de Bravo, a beautiful town about 94 miles southwest of Mexico City. And one of the things he did was he designed houses. Now, he had not been trained as an architect. His two older brothers were, and they became very well-known architects in Buenos Aires. And in fact, I have some Argentinian family members now, friends who know the name Kalnay because of their prominence as architects in Buenos Aires. And so my grandfather, not having been trained as an architect, still designed 25 houses in Valle de Bravo and gave it what some people have said is its particular architectural style as this in this tourist town, with those European tiled roofs and very beautiful views of the valley and so on. He also wrote children's books. This is where he wrote the Newbery Award-winning book that I mentioned, did a couple of other books, and gained prominence as a children's book author. And if you Google his name today, none of what I've been describing comes up except his children's books, and you find thousands and thousands of references to his work as a children's book author. He also wrote about food. He was a gourmand and a wonderful cook, and he published articles in House Beautiful magazine. And then, as I said, he designed homes. So here are three of the books he wrote when he was living in Mexico, the children's books. I have a cousin who's actually a very prominent political theorist who has written a small segment in my book analyzing the children's books that Ferenc wrote from a political perspective, which I think is fascinating. Oh, this is one of the House Beautiful articles about food. This one's about using flowers in cooking. And this is one of the 25 homes that he designed in Valle de Bravo. So when he was 75 years old in 1974, he returned to the United States, moved to Carmel. He always lived in beautiful places. But as I said, there was this conspiracy of silence. And he rarely discussed his time in the OSS, and he never spoke of the Holocaust in Hungary. He never told anyone about the death of his mother, or well, his mother died of heart failure, but of his sister's murder or his nephew's murder. And it was only just before he died at age 93, when my cousin in California was with him and overseeing his care. At that point, did he acknowledge our Jewish heritage, and in whispered tones. He died on December 2nd, 1992, and that was the same date that 48 years earlier, his sister had been murdered at the Arrow Cross headquarters in Budapest. This is a watercolor that was done of my grandfather when he was in his 80s. So I'll tell you a little bit about how I undertook the research. Well, I began by talking to family members, those in California. There's an Argentinian scientist who's one of my mother's cousins, daughter of one of the architects in Argentina, who has taught at the University of Maryland for many years. And then in Spain, there's another Argentinian relative, one of my mother's cousins, a son of the other architect in Buenos Aires, who is kind of a self-appointed family historian. He's been wonderful. And actually, in 3 weeks, I'm going to Spain to his son's wedding. I met him only because of this research. I didn't even know of him before I began the research. And so but I went to Spain and spent a few days with him and learned a great deal from him in 2019. And so I'm really looking forward to seeing him again. And we've been in constant correspondence, and it'll be fun to see him and to go to his son's wedding at the end of May. And then I got declassified documents. I went to the National Archives before the pandemic and in College Park, Maryland, and got boxes. I'll show you what they look like and how one works with those. And then I did a Freedom of Information Act, or a FOIA request for declassified personnel files, and got some. And of course, I went to immigration records and ship manifests, and as an academic, libraries are my happy places, and I spent a lot of time in libraries and got wonderful assistance from academic libraries as well, and went to genealogy sites. I went into newspaper archives and the Jewish research sites, which have been just amazing. I'm sure you all know the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum database, which is wonderful. They actually have a Hungary database too, which is extensive and very useful if you have any interest in doing research on Jews in Hungary. And Jewish Gen, which has been remarkably useful. And it's Jewish Gen, not the USHMM, excuse me, that has the Hungary database. And this has over almost 2 million entries in all of the former territories of Hungary. and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So, in addition, I used social media. I used History Hub, and I'll talk a little bit about History Hub in case some of you have not used it. I joined many, many Facebook groups because there are so many Facebook groups about Hungary, about Jews in Hungary, about, of course, the genealogical Facebook groups. And then as the granddaughter of a member of the Office of Strategic Services, I was able to join the OSS Society. And they have a data, what do you call it? An IO where I can correspond and post questions of other OSS members. It's very useful, actually. I could say my grandfather worked in an office in Bari, Italy in 1944, and I'm trying to learn more about ABC there and so forth, and people will respond. And then this is something I haven't seen people talk about much, but I found very useful. Partly, I think, again, as an academic, I may have had a little more access to other academics, but I think it's something that other people could do as well. And what I did was I corresponded with people to learn about topics that I didn't know much about. I didn't know, for example, that there's a field called onomastics. And onomastics is the study of changes in surnames. And I would say for Jews in particular, the study of name changes is, so much based in what was going on historically in the world or in a region with groups of Jews that it's fascinating. And I learned from a Hungarian specialist in onomastics that there's a database that I was able to access that showed me precisely when my grandfather's father changed the family name. Originally it had been Klein, and then he Hungarianized it. There was a lot of pressure to do that in Hungary, and made it Kalnay with an I at the end, Kalnai. And Jews were not allowed to use a spelling that ended in Y because it was more indigenous Hungarian. But later, years later, they were, so that they changed it another time, and that's how it got its current spelling of Kalnay. I mentioned that my great grandmother had been in a psychiatric hospital, so I corresponded with a specialist in psychiatric hospitals in the Austro-Hungarian Empire and learned a great deal about what that must have been like. I corresponded with military historians because that is not my field, and with specialists in Central Europe and in World War I and World War II, and with Mexican sources. So this is what one does in the National Archives. This shows you a page that was printed that gives you a list of documents in just one box that can be checked out in the National Archives. And this is a box that had some documents that I was particularly interested in. For example, the one that I've circled there are records relating to the survey of foreign experts. And I had mentioned earlier that my grandfather was the director of that survey. And then you fill out a slip, just like the old-fashioned library slips, showing exactly what documents you're looking for. And this is where, I mean, these documents, a portion of them have been digitized, but not all of them. Now they are making headway, but there are thousands and thousands of documents that are basically on onion skin pages from, whatever period you're looking at, World War I, World War II, earlier, if you're doing other kinds of research. And so you fill out a call slip, and then the archivist goes in and gets the boxes that you're interested in, puts them on a corral, and you take them out. And you can sit in this nice reading room. You could take photographs of documents that interest you. And that's what I did. I took photographs of hundreds and hundreds of documents that were relevant to the research I was doing about my grandfather's time in the OSS. And here's an example of one of the documents, again, that I took out from these books. You can see at the bottom it says secret, because it's declassified now, but for a long time had been top secret, and some documents still have not been declassified from World War II, amazingly. And there are others, of course, that were destroyed, and one doesn't know precisely how many. So the kinds of materials that I got at the National Archives were branch memos from the places that my grandfather was working in Europe. He also was in Washington for a time and in New York. But during the war, he was mostly in Italy. And then X2, again, that intelligence agency. There were all kinds of memos and reports from his work there. He was also in a division called Special Operations, and I got memos and reports about that. He had offices in Bari, Italy, Caserta, and at one point he was in Istanbul. He was very briefly in London. So I would look up documents from those offices during the time period when he was working there. And intelligence reports on conditions in Nazi occupied countries, which again is basically what he was providing to the Allies. And internal correspondence on regional and country reports, excuse me. So I'll let you read this while I take a sip of water here. I didn't actually use these particular documents because they weren't part of what I was researching for my grandfather, but they may be of interest to some of you. Evidence gathered for the Nuremberg trials and reports on concentration camps and so forth. They have a remarkable wealth of records. Okay, so how did I organize this? Well, I used two tools that I'll tell you about. One is something called Scrivener. Scrivener is a word process, a very sophisticated word processing program for research and for writing. It's for organizing. If you're writing a book, if you're writing a thesis, if you're writing fiction as well as nonfiction, it's a great way to organize projects. It has a steep learning curve, but if you have a big project with hundreds and hundreds of documents, as I did, I found it invaluable. And again, they have templates depending upon what kind of writing you're doing, and a way to separate your research notes from the text of the manuscript. They have something called an inspector for a synopsis of notes. I'll show you what that means. And it's very easy to move around large chunks of text or chapters. You can flip them around quite easily. You can make character lists, and then you can compile them into a manuscript in MS Word with a click of a button. You can work with a split screen, so you're looking at a document on one side and you're taking notes on another, and you can set goals for yourself as well. So here's one document. This is a page from my Scrivener file. I have actually several Scrivener files, but this is the main Scrivener file for the book. And what you see on the left are just many, many headings that I have given to the things that I was researching and some reading I was doing. New research data here on various topics. And this is one document that I took a photograph of, and this is an evaluation of my grandfather's work. And then you can write a synopsis here of whatever it is you want to briefly describe from that document. And the cool thing about that is you can then go into a particular view where it's just like the old-fashioned way of using note cards, where you used to, if you ever did this, you spread your note cards out and you flip them around. Well, these are the synopses of a bunch of different documents, and I can look at them all at once, and I can flip them around. And if I flip them around, it flips the chapter around, or the section of the chapter. So I found it really cool. It's a way to take very complicated materials and simplify them for analysis. And then I used something called Eon Timeline, because there were so many different kinds of dates that I was interested in. What was happening in my grandfather's life? What was happening in other family members' lives in various years? What was happening during the war and in various locations, and so forth. And so you can connect events to people and places and show the relationships. It is not for making a family tree, so it doesn't work for that, but it does This is what it looks like. This is my, again, my EN timeline. So I have events over here, and then you can see which people are mentioned. So if EKF is actually my mother. So if I want to know certain events that related to my mother, this is when my grandfather abandoned my mother and her mother in Hungary. This is when her passport was renewed in Budapest, and so forth. So these are different people referenced in whatever is on the timeline. And then places, and you can sort, I could sort if I want to by what happened in Hungary, what happened in Europe, what happened in Argentina and Buenos Aires, and so forth. So I found it useful. You can also integrate it into Scrivener. And then I told you I was going to mention History Hub. If you haven't used it, it's a crowdsource platform that's run by the National Archives. And people can post questions and get answers from National Archives staff and citizen experts who volunteer with them. And so here's my question, one of the questions I posed to History Hub. I said, I've read a copy of a memo from James R. Murphy, who was head of the counterintelligence X2 branch during World War II, and it was signed Puritan. And in the memo, Puritan refers to jester. Can anyone help me identify these two individuals? And so they answered me. And they said that they searched code name indices and personal name indices, and they located 6 references to jester and Puritan and et cetera, et cetera. So this was very specific down here. These records have not been digitized. So if I wanted to go to those particular files, I'd have to go back to Maryland to the National Archives. Although maybe since I did this, maybe they've been digitized now. But so here's a genealogy example, not my example, but one that I read about on the History Hub website that I thought you might be interested in. Somebody said, are there any records for Mary Durko coming to America between 1890 and 1922? I have no information on Mary Durko other than her having 2 sisters, Stephanie and Pauline. And they said, you need to give us more information, et cetera, where she lived and is Durko her married name, et cetera. So the person gave more information, and then they found the passenger departure and arrival lists and responded very specifically that Mary and Pauline Durko were on the ship, and this is when they departed Hamburg, how old they were, last residence in Russia, et cetera. So it's a very useful, free, crowdsourced resource. And here's just another page from the History Hub website that shows other similar kinds of questions that people are asking. This person was trying to find birth records for her second great-grandmother, Carrie Williams, born at such and such a date, and they sent her the baptism records. And they went to ancestry.com and got a passenger list. So I love citizen volunteer researchers. And as I say, there are also paid archivists at NARA who do this as well. Okay, here are a few things I will never know about my grandfather. One is why he left the OSS so abruptly at the end of the war when he had just received a new assignment. I sent a letter to the FBI asking if he had ever been under investigation. And maybe, that was what, and I got such a non-speak, government non-speak, that neither confirmed nor denied. The mere acknowledgement of the existence or non-existence of such records is itself a classified fact protected by FOIA exemption, blah, 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 blah. And at the end, they say, this is a standard response that should not be read to indicate that any such records do or do not exist. So they didn't answer my question, and they said that this may still be classified, which seems crazy. Another question in my mind is why he and so many of our relatives kept our Jewish heritage a secret. And I'm not going to go into that now, but this is a major topic in my book, and I spend a great deal of time in the book talking about many famous individuals. I'm sure you know some yourselves, and others not so famous who kept the history of their trauma, whether it was in the Holocaust or whether it was the Armenian genocide or even, African Americans after slavery. Many of them didn't speak about the atrocities for a variety of reasons. So I talk about family secrets and why they are maintained across generations. So that's the overview that I wanted to give you of a number of topics in the book. And here are some of the topics that I've not been talking about today, but that are covered in the book. What were the anti-immigrant sentiments like when my grandfather first arrived in the early 1900s? What did he do when he first got to New Brunswick, New Jersey, which at the time was the unofficial headquarters for Hungarians in the United States, which I had never known. And I learned a lot about, the number of Hungarian newspapers and unions and et cetera in New Brunswick. Artists and socialists and mystics in New York in the 20s and the 30s. My grandfather and a neighbor of his, who was also an artist and was married to a Hungarian artist, opened a nudist camp, a socialist nudist camp for artists and writers in the 1920s and the 30s. And I learned that actually some of these naturist camps were pretty common in rural areas in the US. But I write about this and about the ambiance there for socialists in that era. I talk a bit about life in Argentina, which again is where my grandfather's older brother settled. I mentioned that I learned something about psychiatric hospitals in the Austro-Hungarian Empire and what that must have been like for my great-grandmother. I talk about bootlegging in New York State. I won't tell you why, that's a whole story in itself, but I actually even corresponded with the head of the Mob Museum in Chicago to learn something about the history of bootlegging in New York State, and it's fascinating. My grandfather abandoned my mother and her sister and his wife, my grandmother, in Hungary, and he later abandoned his second wife. And so I talk about that. He was a war hero. He was an amazing man, and he was a terrible father. I go into great detail about his life as a spy. What was it like to be a spy in World War II, to be going behind enemy lines? What kind of training did he and others have? I talk about anti-Semitism in the US government at the time he was working there. And then I have sections on his work in Mexico as designing houses, writing about food. And I think I mentioned that my cousin, Wendy Brown, did an analysis of his children's books from a political perspective. And finally, again, a lot of emphasis on why people keep family secrets. So if you want to know more about the book, this is a picture from my website. My website is just my name with no space in the middle. It's just katherinefennelly.com. I've learned that if you put a space in the middle, some real estate broker's named Katherine Fennelly and her site will come up. So if you get a real estate broker, that's the wrong site. It's just Katherine Fennelly, no space.com. And I have photographs in there. I have some recipes from my grandfather's Hungarian cooking and publishing, and I have a description of the book and how one can order the book. And it's again, it's available from my publisher, or it's also available from Amazon, and there's a Kindle version. And so there's going to be, I hope soon, an audio version, but it's not out yet. And so that's all I have to say. Thank you very much for your attention. And my sincere apologies to those of you who arrived late. As Janice will tell you, it had nothing to do with an error that of hers or mine. It was
No.
Zoom that posted an incorrect time. So
And I put a little note in the chat saying that you have allowed us to record it, and they'll be able to watch it
in the near future.
Yeah. I don't know why Zoom did it. I wish I knew why it did it. We did get some questions in the chat. Let's see, go back. Well, there was one comment, Ojai is actually more towards Southern California. How did you find out about the guy in Spain, and how did you make contact with him?
One of my brothers. And to be honest, I don't remember how we first got in touch. I know that I think about it, I do. My West Coast cousins were the ones who knew my grandfather much better, because when he was living in the United States, he lived in California, and that's where they live. And also they sometimes went down to Mexico when he was living there and visited him. And their mother, my aunt, was not estranged from her father in the way that my mother was. So they were closer to him. And they told me about Esteban Kalnay. And I got in touch with him because I was trying to get in touch with every relative I could. So I met some of my relatives in Argentina and so forth. And when I started to, when I was in touch with Esteban, I realized that he knew an enormous amount about our family history. In fact, he's obsessed with our family history and has shown me many, many documents. He was the one who just recently told me that my great aunt had painted that lovely painting, oil painting that I just purchased.
Thank you.
I actually had a question. This was the other question in chat, and I may have misheard you. I thought you said that he created a specialist nudist camp.
Not specialist. It was a nudist camp for artists and socialist.
Ah, okay.
So
I figured I had misheard you.
A socialist nudist. So they were socialists, and many of them very prominent. And I have a whole section in the book. I even have a photo from the camp in the book. But people like Theodore Dreiser went to the camp and had a mistress who was much younger than he. And she wrote a book and she mentioned my grandfather in the book. So I quote that and describe Max Ernst, you know, very famous artist of the time. And he went to the camp and so forth. So that was fun to research, to be honest. It was so interesting.
and I never knew that there were socialist nudist camps. There we go.
Yeah. Well, you know that the notion of free love and equality of the genders and so forth was blended with for many socialists, many European socialists of the era.
Okay. Well, those were the questions that were in chat, and I think Israela has a question because your hand is raised. Don't forget to unmute.
Thank you. Hi, yeah, I have a question. Thank you so much. It's fascinating. So did he completely disconnect from his Jewish identity in retrospect? Like, was there anything, any hints like, you know, that he had a relationship with the Jewish heritage or community, like lots of Jewish friends, or I don't know, something with holidays or anything like that?
Nothing. He never once and I found actually on 23andMe I found a relative. This is now of my grandmother, his wife, and my maternal grandmother, not my grandfather, but she also was Jewish, and she was raised first in Chicago and then in South Bend, Indiana. And the suppression of Judaism was so strong that this woman I met on 23andMe told me that her mother wasn't allowed to go to her grandmother's funeral because it was in a Jewish funeral home in Chicago. And so and in Argentina, my cousin Esteban, the Argentine who's in Spain now, at first he said to me, Kathy, you can't tell our Argentine relatives that we're Jewish. It'll be too shocking to them. They're so Catholic. And I said, I'm sorry, but I refuse to abide by that. Now, after reading my book, he converted in the sense that he told everybody after that about the book, and he wants to translate it into Spanish. So I feel good about that because it's insane that this was kept a secret. So no, my grandfather actually followed Gurdjieff. I don't know if he's a Russian mystic. And I write about Gurdjieff and the Gurdjieff Society, and he was very involved with the Gurdjieff Society in a few places he lived, but never once until the end of his life even hinted that he was Jewish. So it's very sad.
Thank you.
Okay, and Barbara.
Yeah, you answered the first question I have, which was what is the mystical connection? But it seems also that the socialism may be a weak expression of Judaism,
Well,
given
Yeah. Certainly there were many prominent Jews who were socialists in New York, many.
Yeah.
And also in this, the Foreign Language Information Service that I mentioned briefly in the beginning, which is, I believe, the way that my grandfather ultimately entered national service in the US government. They had a Jewish bureau that worked with Yiddish newspapers, and they also had very strong connections with prominent Jews in particularly in New York, who were on the board, one of whom was a director of the FLIS for a while and so forth. So clearly he was working with prominent Jews in a variety of settings. And in the OSS, I mean, the OSS purposely recruited Central European Jews because they spoke so many languages that were needed for Central Europe in particular. But my grandfather, as I say, he never acknowledged being Jewish. So it just came as such a shock. And the thing to me that I write about that actually shocked me more than my grandfather's, I didn't know him very well. I met him maybe 4 times in my life. My grandmother, my mother's mother, I knew intimately. She lived with us for a while. And of course, my mother, and neither one of them ever mentioned this, that my mother never mentioned that her, she had relatives who were murdered, that she was Jewish, and she was so upset when we would talk about religion that in retrospect, unfortunately, I learned a lot of this after she died. But now I see her pushing back in a different light.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Does
Oh, you're
anybody
very
else
welcome.
have any more questions? Oh, Barbara's back again.
Would the bootlegging connection also have been Jewish related?
No, well, actually, the bootlegger, what happened, the short version of what happened was that when my grandfather stranded my mother and her family in Hungary, they were destitute and they had no way to get back to the US. So my grandmother wrote to a wealthy farmer who was not Jewish. He was actually from like a very long line of Protestants in upstate New York. And he became her stepfather. And there's a whole story there about the difficulties of first working on that farm and then living on the farm. And my grandmother married him and so on. But I learned in the course of this book that he had been the bootlegger before he married my grandmother. And he was selling corn liquor from his farm and making $1,000 a day in 1930.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, damn, $1,000 a day in 2024 is a lot of money. But in 1930, it was enormous. So that's why I got all these historical newspapers, and in the book I say, I hope you'll forgive me if I take a short diversion and write about, because it was such a crazy story. So that's what I did.
Cool. Bootlegging is a fascinating subject anyway, because
It's
people
a fascinating subject.
It was
Yeah,
most people. It was strictly financial. This will make me money.
Oh, well, and not only that, but he was indicted. My step grandfather was indicted, but prohibition was repealed before he went to jail. So
that's good timing.
once I started reading this, I thought, I thought an editor's going to tell me to take this out of the book right away, but they no one ever did, so I left it in.
Very cool. So there you have a checkered family background.
My goodness, that is the truth. That's the truth. But as I say, my grandfather, I mean, he was a very important figure, I think, in the Allied victory in Europe. I make a case for that in the book, and I think it's substantiated. He was one of the few foreign-born Americans with access to the coded Nazi encrypted messages. And I mean, he did a lot of amazing things in the war. Again, he was a flawed character. He was a terrible father, but
he excelled in other areas.
he certainly did. Yeah, spoke 7 languages. He designed houses. He I got a chapter of a book that was written by a journalist about the best meal she had ever eaten. That's what her book was about. One of the chapters is about my grandfather and what he prepared and all these homegrown raised. I mean, so he was a remarkable man. So I hope you'll read the book and not just go with the highlights from here.
Well, of course, now we have to know the rest of the story, right?
Exactly, exactly.
Does anybody else have any other questions? Because if not, I think we should let her have the rest of her Monday evening back on East Coast time. Thank you so much for speaking to the group. We really do appreciate it.
Very welcome.
And keep coming to meetings too. I mean, because I know you're on mailing lists. So yeah.
I am. Okay. Well, thank you. And again, I'm katherinefennelly.com. There's a lot more
Which is
information,
also in the handout. I put
and
the
it's in the
URL for the
handout.
handout.
Okay. Good
Thank
night,
you again.
everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
See you at our next meeting.